A small group of college students didn't just beat the state lottery tickets because they consistently won the prizes for 7 years, thousands of times in plain sight. But surprisingly, inside the government filing cabinet in Boston, there was a report that basically says that the state knew what is going on the whole time. Therefore, the question was not just how exactly they found the loophole in the first place. The real question is, why doesn't anyone immediately do something about it? They even called their operation Random Strategies Investments. Eventually, by the time the official actually noticed it, it was legit a company. But it just got worse. Here is the part that's really unsettling about the situation. In July of 2012, the Massachusetts Office of the Inspector General released a report on a lottery game called Cash WinFall. Basically, the report spans hundreds of pages, which contains the transaction data, internal emails, memoranda, and a reconstructed timelines. But it's not a press release because it's a physical government document that was commissioned, researched, written, and filed together. Everything exists is boiled down for one particular reason. It was the lottery clerks that noticed about something suspicious that could possibly went wrong at the moment. That's because they just realized that a handful of stores were processing the ticket with the unreasonable large amount of volume to a point where the machines always ran out of paper. To put that into perspective, some locations were selling more tickets in a single day than a typical convenience store sells in a month. Therefore, the receipts were piling up because the machines were running continuously. But surprisingly, the customers who bought the tickets were not just a random walk-in players that casually happened to be there for no reason. That's because they were the same people, week after week, filling out slip after slip with systematic number of combinations. Suddenly, that observation alone was triggering an official investigation that the system was designed to ignore. But why would they bother to do that in the first place? The story began with the state treasurer, Stephen Grossman, that had requested the inquiry after taking the office in 2011. He inherited an oversight of the lottery, and therefore, he inherited a game that had been successfully running for nearly 8 years. Grossman asked Inspector General Gregory W. Sullivan to examine what exactly the lottery's own staff had missed, and precisely calculated what to address on this case. Therefore, the Sullivan's office obtained and analyzed the voluminous ticket level and retailer level data from the lottery's computer systems, and what they found is very alarming. When they reviewed the internal lottery documents, including emails and meeting notes, they conducted interviews with lottery staff, retailers, and members of the betting groups. Turns out it was a very devastating discovery, knowing that they were not just dealing with anybody because it was all done by a genius. Surprisingly, the reports from the investigation and the interviews revealing that the lottery-owned staff was new as early as 2005, which a small group of gambling syndicates had virtually taken over the Cash WinFall. They were winning most of the prizes during high payoff periods by buying hundreds of thousands of tickets at the same time. But what's made this occasion so special was the way they did it was not random at all. It's a well-calculated pattern in a way that almost flawless. Surprisingly, the lottery didn't really do anything about it. That's until the damages become so big, it creates the pressure to act immediately. Therefore, the Sullivan's office traced the pattern across the 7 years of data, and they found something unsettling. Basically, they found that roll-down drawings weren't occasionally dominated by many syndicates. They were consistently dominated using the same stores by the same buyers with the consistently large amount of volume. In other words, the pattern here was so consistent that it should have triggered the automatic review system, but yet it didn't. It almost felt like a perfectly scripted scenario that every detail is calculated and leave no track at all. But that's until you actually see from the point of view of the mastermind. To understand what exactly is going on, you must first need to understand what was the game supposed to look like. And the best way to do that is to start with the probability of the outcome. In August of 2010, a group of people bought 700,000 tickets for one Cash WinFall drawing. Suddenly, they just won a whopping 860 tickets from the 983 winning tickets, with each worth $600 and more. Therefore, they purchased more than 80% of all tickets sold that day. Surprisingly, the lottery knew this was going to happen because the lottery had to approve the extra ticket sales for the stores, which the group was frequently frequently visited. In other words, the finance department had to sign off on the extra sales, which they never really told to the employees whose job was to predict the jackpots for the public. But this is only the beginning of the actual plan. Things will get more interesting. Those numbers alone should have been impossible in a fair game. But the cash windfall wasn't really made to be fair in the way that most people assume the lotteries are supposed to look like. Basically, it was a draw-style game where the players picked 6 numbers from a pool of 46. In order to win the top prize, all you had to do is match every 6 numbers that you picked. But if you only managed to match 5, 4, or just 3 numbers, you will only get the subordinate prizes. Therefore, if your ticket's matching with only 2 or fewer numbers, you won nothing. The ticket only cost you $2. But here's where the design became unusual. The jackpot was capped at $2 million. Therefore, when the prize reached that limit but no one matched all the 6 numbers, the unclaimed jackpot didn't roll over into a larger future prize. It actually rolled down into the lower prize tiers. This is what it called the roll-down days. Basically, when matching the 5 of 6 numbers could pay you $40,000 instead of just the usual $4,000. Similarly, if you're matching 4 numbers, you could get $2,000 instead of $200. And at the very least, matching 3 numbers will pay $150 instead of just $10. The lottery marketed these days as special events, which are more ways to win for the player. Unfortunately, what the marketing described as generosity by using bigger prizes for matching the fewer numbers, the probability from this calculation was create something else entirely. Basically, here is how it works. The expected value is the weighted average of all possible payoffs from a ticket minus the ticket price. For example, if you play lottery with regular standard, the expected value is always negative. That's because the sum of all the prizes divided by the number of the available tickets resulting in less than the cost of buying in. Basically, that's just how the lottery generates its revenue. But the cash windfall's roll-down rule changed the payout distribution on certain drawings, meaning that when the jackpot carryover and the number of tickets sold fell within any specific ranges, the total expected payout per ticket exceeded its original $2 ticket's price. In other words, the game has temporarily become a positive expected value investment. But the catch here was a scale. Any player that bought 10 tickets couldn't rely on the theoretical probabilities because the variance would overwhelm them. In other words, they won't win any significant prizes because their 10 tickets might only match 2 numbers or even less. Therefore, the outcome would be almost entirely beyond predictable. But if you bought 600,000 tickets or more, you could expect the actual distribution of wins to closely approximate the theoretical odds. Therefore, the law of large numbers, also known as scale, converted a probabilistic edge into a near-certain profit. Think of it like this. If you flip a coin 10 times and the result might be 7 heads and 3 tails, that result is one of its variants. But if you flip a coin 600,000 times, the result would fall very closely to 300,000 heads and 300,000 tails. In other words, the more tickets you bought, the more closely your actual wins would match that mathematical prediction. For any large-scale syndicates, the ability to purchase hundreds of thousands of tickets transformed cash windfall into a quasi-investment product with a positive edge. Therefore, the same mathematical insight was worth nothing to a small group of participants could be worth millions toward a group that could optimize the necessary resources to beat its probability outcomes. Therefore, the groups calculated that they could expect to earn 15 to 20% more than they spent on tickets, especially when it's time for the qualifying roll-down drawings. Let's extend this example even further. For every $2 ticket, the mathematical expectation of the payout could rise to approximately $2.30. That's a 30-cent edge per ticket in expectation. But it only works if you bought over 600,000 tickets, because that edge compounds into a reliable return. Therefore, it's not really a gamble after all, it's a precise calculation. The math here was very clear, printed on every single ticket. The rules were there and the probabilities were fixed. Therefore, the Massachusetts State Lottery had created, in fact, a combination between a typical negative expected value lottery and a periodic positive expected value investment opportunity at the same time. All you need to do was examine the spreadsheet, use some basic understanding of combinatorics, and the capital to buy enough tickets to let the math work. Surprisingly, this hack is not just a cheap cheat code. It was a structural flaw inside a government-run financial product that anyone with the right tools and enough capital could exploit. Therefore, things just took a turn for the worst, and here's the part that they never saw it coming. In early 2005, James Harvey was just an MIT undergraduate looking for a subject for his senior independent study. He wasn't a professional gambler at all. He was a math student who specifically obsessed over an interesting problem, and because of that, he chose the cash windfall as his subject. It only took him a few days to model the prize distributions and calculate the expected values under various jackpot and ticket sale scenarios. Basically, he built a spreadsheet that perfectly simulated how different levels of bets would play out over many hypothetical drawings. In other words, he estimated the variance and confidence intervals as well as the expected value. Eventually, he actually tested his model. On February 7, 2005, Harvey bought $1,000 worth of tickets for a roll-down drawing, and surprisingly, he won $3,000 prize from his tickets. Therefore, his model worked. The positive outcome validated his calculations and encouraged him to do a further scaling. He's very confident that he didn't just get lucky because the outcome is under his calculation. Although the result from his first test was quite small by the comparison of what is going to do next, it's actually very significant at the same time because it converted theoretical insight into a real financial stake. Over the following months, Harvey kept refining his analysis. Suddenly, he realized that the key to making the cash windfall to be as profitable as possible wasn't just about recognizing the positive expected value. It also included to reach a scale where the variance became manageable. For example, the threshold that he identified was around $600,000 in ticket purchases per drawing. Using that volume makes the distribution of 5-number, 4-number, and 3-number matches would closely approximate to the game's theoretical probabilities. In other words, Harvey's spreadsheet turned cash windfall into a statistical machine. Basically, when you fed enough tickets and given roll-down conditions, it converted capital into a reasonably predictable return with manageable variance of outcomes. He knew exactly what is going to do with this potential opportunity. Therefore, his early experiments inspired others to betting pools on the MIT campus, but he really made sure to make it a large scale. In order to do that, he formed a company with fellow student Yuran Liu and named it Random Strategies Investments. That name itself came after the random hall at the MIT dorm where their plan and ideas was first developed. Surprisingly, the randomness in their model was not about a risk to avoid. It was just a variable to be diversified away. Basically, here's exactly how the company really works. The company operated with a formal structure that had its members and shares. They raised an outside capital from friends, classmates, and any associates who wanted to get exposure from the strategy. Basically, it functions season to season to identify a roll-down opportunities, deploying capital, purchasing tickets, and distributing the returns. But things just took a turn for a chaos very quickly because the operational reality was a painstaking. For example, the Random Strategies officials spent many hours filling out betting slips manually by hand. They didn't use lucky numbers or personal combinations. Therefore, they treated each of the ticket as a statistically identical claim on the prize pool. That's because they bought the tickets at a few hand-picked stores that could only handle a lower volume. Therefore, they had to manage the logistical complexity of generating, printing, and storing hundreds of thousands of physical paper tickets. This has become the risk that outside from his prediction at all, but yet, he still need to deal with that obnoxious little things in order to make his company make profit. These were the variables that needs to be fixed that was not inside the probability itself. But what none of them knew yet is the boundaries that they should have never crossed. Between 2005 and 2012, the company made between $17 million and $18 million on cash windfall alone. Surprisingly, the Sullivan's report estimated that they earned at least $3.5 million in profit, which is not bad for a student project that started with a $1,000 test, and suddenly they make this much amount of remarkable return. But it's very important for you to understand what is exactly happening behind the scheme. It wasn't really luck or intuition. It was a systematic application of expected value analysis which scaled to the point where the probability became reliable. Eventually, the company reached its operational peak in August of 2010. Harvey and his partners had realized something that the game's designers hadn't really anticipated. If they bought a necessary amount of tickets, they could have just pushed the jackpot to its $2 million cap and trigger a roll down themselves. Therefore, they didn't need to wait for a natural roll down when they could have just manufactured it to happen right away. Suddenly, the company began to quietly buying up so many tickets to force the event. Surprisingly, the lottery officials remained silent as the stockpiling is continued. Because of that, the MIT group had bought more than 80% of the tickets for that single drawing and claimed the vast majority of the significant prizes. But what makes this particular scheme remarkable isn't about the ingenuity of the strategy. It's just that the strategy required no secrecy. The tickets were bought on public, and the stores were chosen for their capacity and not their discretion. Plus, the lottery's own systems just casually tracked every single purchase they had. Basically, they don't need to really hiding from anyone because the problem is their own regulation. Surprisingly, the Inspector General's report reveals something that the company never see it coming. The random strategies wasn't unique at all. The same mathematical flaw was discovered independently by at least 2 other major groups operating in parallel. Therefore, they didn't know each other, and they didn't share no information. Basically, they just simply ran the same calculation on the Cash WinFall, which reached the similar conclusion. GS Investment Strategies, which a Michigan-based syndicate that typically aimed to buy around 312,000 tickets per roll down to ensure profits. Suddenly, on July 14, 2011, they placed their largest bet ever. They spent $720,000 on 360,000 tickets. Basically, their operation ran on the same principles as random strategies. The only difference was their geography and the names on the membership rolls. Surprisingly, there's another group that made up by the scientists from Boston University and Northeastern University, which they started betting in 2005 after analyzing Cash WinFall and realizing the odds are favored the large-scale bettors. This group was led by Dr. Ying Zhang. Basically, he formed an entity called the Dr. Zhang Lottery Club Limited Partnership. His job was to advise everyone he met to put more money into the game, or at least that's what Zhang told the investigators. Therefore, he made a steady profits from the beginning, just as his calculations had suggested. Because of that, he left his day job in 2006 as a biomedical researcher to focus mainly on Cash WinFall. That's led to a point that the recurrence is in fact repeatable. Therefore, each of this company didn't just stumble upon a secret and crack the code. They simply applied a standard probability theory toward a lottery system which was made for public and found a loophole that was quite visible to anyone who carefully pay attention. In other words, when multiple independent parties discover the same flaw inside a system, the exploitation itself is not a trick anymore. It became a commodity. Therefore, the system itself is broken. Because of that, the market will adapt it precisely in the direction of the game's structure. Surprisingly, the lottery's response to this recurrence is perhaps the most revealing than that manipulation behavior itself. In April of 2010, a compliance officer named John Marino visited 2 Western Massachusetts stores where the Michigan group routinely spent hundreds of thousands of dollars during a roll-downs. But he found no problem at all. Basically, in his report, he wrote that everything was very organized and ran smoothly. He even noted that the owners of both stores were part of the Michigan Betting Club. Surprisingly, the lottery's reaction wasn't to investigate even further. They even placed a second Cash WinFall machine at both Billy's Beverage of Sunderland and Jerry's Place in South Deerfield, so the gamblers could process more bets even faster. But why does the state casually place an extra infrastructure inside the stores explicitly to serve the syndicates? It wasn't even a passive tolerance anymore. It was an active accommodation. Surprisingly, the lottery supervisor wrote in an email that basically say, "How do I become part of the club when I retire? This is somehow has become a win-win situation for everyone. But someone or something should have taken the fall of its consequences." The Inspector General found that the lottery knew the syndicates were buying up hundreds of thousands of their tickets, but the lottery had to approve the extra sales, and the finance department processed the requests. Meanwhile, the compliance officers casually visited the stores, and everyone saw what was happening. Basically, they treated it as a sales success rather than a structural failure. Because of that, the institution that just created the loophole not only allowed everyone to abuse it, they even improved their ability to do so. But the story was not ends there, because what really happened next is quite concerning. The Inspector General's report just reveals its discovery that very unsettling. Sullivan concluded that the lottery was aware of the gamblers' activities as far back as 2005. They cracked down only after the officials feared about negative publicity. Therefore, the lottery had failed to manage the game to enforce its own rules. But Sullivan also reached a conclusion that frames this entire scheme is in fact institutional rather than a criminal frame, because he found that the game was, in his own words, a financial success for the lottery itself. But how does that even possible in the first place? The answer is plain and simple. Every time someone bought millions of tickets, the lottery took its 40% cut from every single one of them. Therefore, the revenue continued to flow. Needless to say that this is not a fraud, cheating, or inside information for the players. It emphasized that everyone were playing by the rules of the game. Basically, they paid for every ticket, which relied on probability analysis rather than any form of manipulation of the drawings or the systems. The OIG's critique even focused on the lottery's failure to manage the broader implications of a game that could be mathematically beaten by sophisticated players, in an environment where the lottery's public mission and the vulnerability of casual participants were at stake. In other words, the commission allowed a small number of professionals to dominate the prize pool. To put that into perspective, the Lottery Commission's revenue depended on its ticket sales, regardless of who would profited from the flaw, because high-volume bettors generated high-volume revenue. Therefore, there was no institutional incentive could do to stop what they do. There was, in fact, an institutional incentive to actually accommodate them. For example, extra ticket machines were installed, sales volumes were approved without any further question, and the compliance officers would visit stores and found no problems at all. Their system didn't fail to detect any crime syndicates because the system has detected what they actually did and adapted to serve them. Consider what that means for the casual player, which a typical Cash WinFall participant who bought a handful of tickets on a roll-down day, attracted by the marketing of the bigger prizes. Basically, they were playing a game where the expected value was temporarily positive, but only at a scale that they could never reach. Their 10 tickets were still the part of subject to variance, but they always win nothing most of the time. They were, in effect, just subsidizing the infrastructure that allowed the bigger players to extract at the structural edge. Surprisingly, the lottery was marketed as a public benefit, which a harmless form of entertainment that funded the state programs. But particularly during a roll-down periods, it functioned as a transfer mechanism where small players provided the ticket volume that made for the large players to win the prizes. Therefore, the bigger players didn't stealing anything from the lottery. They're just casually playing the lottery by following the rules, but they use a design that most players had never anticipated its coming. However, the report recommended a clearer oversight for any high-volume player with more rigorous game design review, and a stronger protections to ensure the fairness for basically everyone. But it's never had any further action against lottery officials, concluding that they received no personal benefit from the syndicates' activities. Therefore, the report just closes its formal recommendations with the language of procedural reform. Meanwhile, it doesn't really answer the underlying question. Therefore, the incentives remain the same, and nothing in that investigation explains what would prevent the same outcome from occurring again. Fortunately, the entire scheme wouldn't last for very long. In January of 2012, the Massachusetts State Lottery finally announced that Cash WinFall was officially discontinued, which appeared on the lottery's website. Surprisingly, there was no press conference and no public explanation. The game just simply ceased to exist and removed from the schedule like any other underperforming product. But the actual dismantling was actually begun much earlier. After the Boston Globe reported on the syndicate's dominance in July of 2011, State Treasurer Stephen Grossman took action immediately about it. He disciplined the owners of 2 stores that had allowed the Michigan group to operate the ticket machines by themselves. He also restricted the number of tickets that any store could sell in a day. Therefore, these restrictions essentially ended the group's ability to execute their strategy at scale. In other words, they could no longer buy the volume they needed, and the game was phased out shortly afterward. Grossman publicly apologized about the situation. He stated that the game had been created a loophole that allowed syndicates to gain special opportunities that others didn't have. He referenced that the machines operated after hours, a partnerships with lottery agents, and a practices that doesn't feel appropriate for him. He saw the entire scheme as a teachable moment about the integrity of the lottery. Therefore, he wanted to send a message that the integrity of the lottery was a paramount of importance. But what actually changed about the game itself? Because the roll-down mechanic wasn't patched, the cap also wasn't being restructured, and the prize distribution itself wasn't recalculated to eliminate the positive expected value condition. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the cash windfall was simply removed. The structural vulnerability, which a situation that the expected payout per ticket could exceed the ticket price under a certain conditions, was eliminated by removing the product rather than correcting the design. Eventually, for the company that heavily rely on the lottery, the ending was abrupt but not punitive. No one was charged with a crime, and no one was fined. The report explicitly cleared the betting groups of any wrongdoing. In the end, the students, scientists, or the retirees who had run the numbers simply stopped buying the tickets when the game disappeared. But things took a devastating turn, especially for them. The Inspector General's report contains hundreds of pages of evidence, which basically the documents about transactions, interviews, and internal communications with a precision that the lottery itself was never applied to its own game. Therefore, it has the syndicates' names, it counts the tickets, and traces the money, and also reconstructs the 7-year timeline with a thoroughness that the Lottery Commission never attempted while the game was running. But on top of that, why the lottery allowed this to continue for 7 years, which the report offers procedure without any causality. They record that the finance department approved the extra sales and failed to notify other departments. It notes that the compliance officers visited stores and found no problems at all. In other words, they maps the flow of revenue very carefully from ticket sales through the lottery's accounting systems to the state budget. From this reasoning alone, you can tell that it's a win situation for everyone, except for one little thing. The people that casually bought the tickets hoping to win the prizes without any calculation whatsoever, they're the one who took the fall for everyone.